What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Ultimate Invasion, and I'm really excited to see what you guys think about this story because one, it's amazing, and two, the ending is nuts. So here's the thing. This picks up in the aftermath of the gigantic attack that we saw at the end of the last video, which is to say all these different versions of like Captain America and Vision and so on, Thor, whatever, just appearing out of nowhere and going against like the Maker and his forces. Now remember, the Maker is a version of Reed Richards from an alternate reality called the Ultimate Universe that has long since been destroyed. What he's doing here is he's manipulating the history of this universe to turn it into the Ultimate Universe. That's why it's called 6160 instead of 1610, which is the normal designation for the Ultimate Universe in Marvel Comics. But following that gigantic attack, we end up picking up in Latveria. Now, you guys are going to inevitably ask the question, where is Dr. Doom? We will find out. But here's the thing, it initially takes place with Anthony Stark meeting Emmanuel DaCosta. Now, much like Tony Stark, the way he inherited his money from his father following the death of Howard Stark, Robert DaCosta had inherited his money and his company from his father as well. The difference here is that neither of the dads are dead. Both of these guys are still very much alive. But the other thing about this is that we learn a few things that are kind of finicky, right? Howard Stark has never really been in this room with these people before. And most everybody here that he sees are straight up villains, right? They're bad guys. On the world stage, they're the enemy, and they have been for a pretty long amount of time. A really good example of this is Sunspot, who is like an X-Man, right? He's a good guy. He's a hero in the traditional Ultimate Universe. The kicker to this is that in this reality, not only is he a villain, but whenever he has the mask on and he's operating as a hero, you cannot talk to him directly, right? If you try to, they'll have you put to death. The only thing you can do is talk to his, really the voice as they refer to it, known as Viper. It just works that way, right? That's just kind of how he runs things. He's extremely hardcore. Then you have what's called Ra and Khonshu, which are basically these two guys that kind of rule the upper and lower kingdoms, which is to say Ra only talks when it's daytime, Khonshu only talks when it's nighttime. So it's really interesting how these guys all kind of function. But then we're introduced to a guy named Henry Duggery, who possesses both the Sword of Might and the Amulet of Right. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that means, you've probably heard of the superhero Captain Britain, Brian Braddock. Of course, that was a great big huge talking point during Avengers Endgame when Peggy Carter had mentioned Brian Braddock's name and everybody was super excited and so on and so forth. Brian Braddock is a British superhero who attained what was called the Amulet of Right, which basically allows him to turn into Captain Britain. He's not crazy, astronomically powerful or anything, but in order to get the Amulet of Right, he had to make a choice. He had to choose between that or the Sword of Might. Very rarely do you ever see a Captain Britain that actually has both. This guy does, which makes him immensely powerful. But then we're introduced to the legendary Hulk. And the legendary Hulk, like we mentioned in previous videos, just stands in stark contrast to the Ultimate Universe Hulk that we're traditionally familiar with. The Ultimate Universe Hulk was like a cannibal, right? He was crazy. He would just like consume human beings. There was a really cool story where he ripped Wolverine in half. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy things with his character, but this kind of almost basically heroic version, right? The guy who has really achieved transcendence and moved beyond any measure of violence and is more almost like a monk than anything else is pretty wild. For those of you guys who are familiar with the Age of Apocalypse storyline in the 1990s, he's very similar to the way Cain Marko was back then, the way that Juggernaut was during that point in time. And he's very similar to the Hulk during House of M, if I remember correctly, because I feel like he became a monk in that story as well. But the cool thing here is that when the legendary Hulk shows up, Howard Stark starts asking questions and he's like, look, I mean, what's going on here? Like, these guys are all bad guys, right? Like, these guys are all villains. Like, what in the world is happening here? And so everybody kind of looks at him a little bit funny, like, what do you mean they're all villains, right? And that's when it starts to dawn on all of them, Howard Stark doesn't fully understand what's going on here. Seemingly, Obadiah Stane did, but if he did, he never made Howard Stark aware of how the world actually functions. Now, this reveal that I'm going to bring to you is one part crazy, right? But also genius at the same time. And it's just straight up diabolical, right? So the way this works is that On Earth, in this reality, due to the machinations and the manipulations of the Maker, everybody in this room is a villain, but no one's a villain at the same time, right? The response of the Hulk is, I promise you, Mr. Stark, however it might appear to the world at large, there are no enemies in this room. The response of Howard is, I think you're forgetting the Eastern conflict and that event in the Pacific. What about the winter apocalypse? I could go on. Ask any man on the street and they would disagree, as would history, as would I. And the response of the legendary Hulk is, that is the world as you know it. Look around this place and you will see that there are 7 major territories represented. And though we have not yet fully circled this sun, when our time has come, each of our nations will play the quote-unquote adversary just as the Rasputins do now. While inside our non-adversarial nations, we rally our citizens against this great evil and all participate in whatever pageantry is required. Then, at the end of a generation, another territory, one that has spent the previous age becoming more and more belligerent, assumes the quote-unquote rogue state mantle, while the previous one engages in a generation of performative regret. It is amazing, like this, just the sheer scale of this. The general human population has no idea that this is happening. They have no idea it's going on, right? The territory of the Rasputins are bad guys. Why are they bad guys? Because they do terrible and awful things and so on and so forth, right? But then like the world unites against them and the Rasputins are defeated. And then the Rasputins kind of spend all this time, my God, we did such terrible things. We did such awful things. But then suddenly the entire territory of the Hulk becomes evil, right? And they've been becoming evil for quite some time. And they in turn are the ones that the world rallies against. And while humanity is jumping from one foot to the next, these guys are just maintaining control. It's all theater. It's all a show. And what's so crazy about this is looking at the world right now doesn't really seem impossible. So it's a really phenomenal thing because when Howard Stark hears this, it blows his mind. Just the level of diabolical, just the level of manipulation, right? This is like one of the most diabolical things that this guy's ever heard of. The entirety of the human population is being manipulated by the people in this room. But what Legendary Hulk does is he answers the question of why they would even do that in the first place. And the response comes both by way of Emmanuel DaCosta as well as Legendary Hulk himself, right? The response is the problem has been studied. The Maker did several iterations of experimental societies inside the city. He has shown us the results. Peace achieved through coercion or enforced is never successful for a long-term strategy. The truth is, humanity is incapable of accepting peace. Now, the Hulk follows up and says, to be fair, not all of us agree with such universal assumptions, Mr. Stark. I believe that some people, many even, are capable of achieving a state of inner calm that presents as peace. I have to believe it. I've devoted my life to it, but most are incapable of maintaining that state in perpetuity. They can't handle the quiet. They can't let their action be inaction. They can't maintain serenity with all the hysterical babbling that surrounds them. So literally, the entire argument here is that humanity needs war. Right now, it may just simply be that in the here and now, humanity is pretty primitive, right? For all the advancements in technology and stuff like that, our brain is still kind of dumb, right? It hasn't quite caught up with like humanity in its current form. It still functions from decades ago, right? The whole idea of fight or flight, right? 2 cavemen are walking along the road and they both hear rustling in the bushes. The one who ran away lived longer than the one who went to go investigate. You know what I mean? It's that kind of a thing, right? So with all of that in mind and realizing that the nature of humanity is to wage war, it is to fight. If things stay restless for too long, humanity will self-destruct. Then ultimately they had to create this whole sense of theater in order to bring peace to what is basically a world that's incapable of doing it on its own. So it's really, really genius, right? It's really cool. And if I were a guy who was running the world, this is exactly what I would do, right? It's just this really genius thing. But then you ultimately have Hulk who says, I wish it wasn't true. But then the response of the Maker who shows up and says, it is. And it always has been. And he says, of course, focusing on shortcomings of mankind's nature makes it easier for those in this room to gloss over the other major reason we do this. The little people hate us. We giants who rule the land. It's not how it used to be in the ages gone by. Back then, it wouldn't have mattered, right? The powerful would have just rolled right over the powerless if need be. But what he says is this is why it's necessary to give them something else to focus on, which we have gotten very good at doing. So it's really, really interesting, right? Like literally they're just manufacturing conflict. They're creating reasons for humanity to be upset because humanity needs to be upset. So it's a very, very cynical perspective of human nature, but the Maker being what he is and basically creating the city, which is a giant dome where time passes differently and he can effectively create entire crops of societies, this is what he's come to realize. It's very similar to the Matrix, right? Like the motivation behind the nature of the Matrix. So the question that Howard Stark has is, if all of this, right, this well choreographed dance of yours is to keep the people happy so that we can get on with the important work of what giants do you mind telling me what the real work is? Now, switch over to the city itself. Again, just this gigantic dome that was created by the Maker that allows time to pass differently, right? The Immortus machine is basically how time is used within the city. It's the way in which Reed is able to manipulate time. He basically created a time travel machine. That's really all it is, right? It's like a giant time machine. But what he does here is where Howard Stark is asking these questions, there aren't a whole lot of answers given by Reed himself, or the Maker, if we want to call him that. So what he does here is he brings him to what's basically his assistant, and he tells him, this is the guy that you're going to be working with. Now, Howard Stark's initial response is, I work alone, right? I don't work with anybody else. But when it comes to this whole process, the response of the Maker is, nobody works alone here. Everybody works in pairs. This here is Reed Richards from this universe. Some say he's the smartest man in this universe, and I'm inclined to agree. Only for us to find out this version of Reed is Dr. Doom. But that's not the kicker, right? Here's the answer to the question. You guys wanted to know where Victor Von Doom was at, or really where Dr. Doom was at. It's not really Victor Von Doom. It's basically Reed here. Now, how it is this Reed became Dr. Doom, we don't fully know, and I'm really excited to find out. Hopefully we do. But this is where the ending gets crazy, because some of you guys called this. In the last video, some of you guys were just like, I know exactly who it was that sent all those enemies from out of nowhere to attack Reed. I'm sorry, to attack the Maker and all those guys. Some of you guys already called it, right? Here's the thing. We jump to the far future. There's your first clue right there, right? And you have this version of Captain America that says 4,000 years of careful genetic engineering was all for nothing. Despair and the end of all things was before us, but we did not yield. Now we have 6,000 years of better stock, righteous blood, and your armies have been replaced. How much longer must we wait, Master? How much longer can we wait? And this person silences them and says, do you see how he hides in this game we play? I, ageless and immortal, in real time, my adversary, a creature of a temporal vault, a time thief if there ever was one. And what do we say of all pretenders? The response of his army, their time will come. And he says, tell me of my legions, right? He's told they are infinite, they are immortal, they are ready to die. His response, this pleases me, it makes me eager. I have heard your cries, I have heard you ask me, Kang, is it time? And so I tell you truly, the time is now. Here's the question that we have to ask. And this is the thing that I had to ask myself when it came to this. Is this Nathaniel Richards, Kang the Conqueror? Or is it the Ultimate Universe Kang the Conqueror? Because they are not the same. And Ultimate Universe Kang was dope. All indications is that it is Nathaniel Richards. And if you understand why I'm making that statement, then you know, right? If you don't, well, then just roll with it. But just looking at him, it looks like Nathaniel Richards. But I'm excited. Let me know down in the comments section. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up on Ultimate Invasion, make sure to click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.